before we get there, let's deal with sort of one of the biggest questions that I've been getting from people, and I think everyone's really curious about, which is, inevitably there's going to be positive tests that happen in your club. A member gets tested positive, they let you know, or someone lets you know, like the whole process of it. And I know you guys have had some. So, what was it like dealing with that first positive test? Or, how many, I guess the question is like, how many check-ins have you had? How many positive tests have you had to deal with in your clubs? And what has the process been like when you've had one of those?
Sure. Yeah. So we've had, since we reopened June 1st, we've had almost 1 million check-ins company-wide. And we've had 4 exposure cases, meaning somebody has possibly had COVID-19 while they've been in our facility. So what happens on our first one, actually, I'll share with you. I was preparing for this, maybe over preparing for this, to the point where when the health authorities ended up getting in contact with me with our first possible exposure case, I was actually like, "This is okay, great, let's go." Like I was using these positive words, like "great, awesome," and then I realized, well, I'm talking about COVID-19, not so great. But I was excited about being prepared and ready, and I think again, our industry was prepared and ready for it. And I think we weren't the first, second, or third club to get a COVID-19 exposure. We were down the line, but once we had one, we were definitely prepared. And so health authorities contacted us and they worked with us. And what happens here out in BC is they let you know the day and the time, and they don't share with you, obviously out of protection, the name of the member that tested positive. They share with you when they were in the club, the times that they were in the club. And at Club 16, it's as easy as pulling a report for those times, slightly before, slightly after, pulling the names, all the email addresses, and immediately emailing those members with a letter from the health authorities that they've created, and then a letter from Club 16 to remind them to keep distance, hygiene, protection, and a reminder of all of our guidelines. And then we have open communication from there. And one of the biggest things that I've come to understand working with the health authorities is that it's not only what the health club operators know about guidelines and know about COVID-19, it's also about the members who test positive. So they're heavily communicating with the people that test positive through contact tracing. They're finding out what businesses were in the last 14 days. And then they're asking the public, what do you know about businesses' guidelines that you've been in? And so the key to success in my mind is a strong relationship with your members, a strong education for your members on your guidelines, so that one, they're following them, and two, when the health authorities contact them, and if it's I think like I'm supposed to book in on an app rather than, it's, I come in, I wash my hands, I stay 2 meters apart, I wear my mask in this section, they have indicated on it, then there is less of there's a risk assessment they do, and there's less of a risk of transmission. So they're very happy to hear that. So
sorry, we got cut off there a little bit, but you're talking about dealing with public health. How when the member was contacted, they also knew what was going on. Public health kind of went back and knew what was built in, and was very impressed with everything that had been put in place and the reminders that were there. And I think that's one thing that people don't necessarily realize, and are starting to a little bit more, which is just that fitness, probably uniquely compared to any other industry, has contact tracing built right into it, and how effective, when there is a positive test, the clubs for the most part are able to pull that report right away, like you said, and say, hey, here's everybody that needs to be contacted, and it's within 24 hours of that positive test, everybody that may have had a potential exposure is able to go, public health is right there. They're able to contact people. We're able to get that out. That's not the case in a grocery store or in any other business for that part, right? You saw airplanes, they just say, if you're in this airplane and in these rows, you should think about getting tested. And it's just this public, this newspaper article gets published. It's the same, they don't really know about other stores, to be able to do it. Whereas the fitnessers, you can just instantly put that list up, which just adds that extra layer of protection. So it's really positive to hear that public health was so impressed with the guidelines you had and how quickly and responsive you could be to that. That was one of my questions, was how are the interactions with public health and sort of dealing with contact tracing, but it sounds like, they kind of took it and just ran with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, I was just sharing that, they talk to the member, they talk to your front of house staff, and they talk to you, and they make a risk assessment on who needs to know and when. And they've also communicated clearly that they don't want to cause panic where there isn't a necessity for panic. They ask members not to take tests, not to go get tests, but they do ask you to observe yourself for symptoms of COVID-19 over the next few days, and that's it. So, and you say like within 24 hours, I'm talking fitness facilities in our industry send this message out within the hour of health authorities telling us, because that's how quickly a report like that is to just pull and start contacting people. And people have been responsive. I'll share it with staff. Our first experience with this at one of our locations, share with them why they are safe, because they're distant, they're hygienic, they're protecting themselves and protecting others, and to observe for symptoms themselves as well. But we work with our staff with scripting and the questions that they could be asked from members, and we really want them educated, because it's important that belief and trust that I was talking to you about also flows out into the community and our members and guests that are within our facility, and that comes from our frontline staff. So it's important to spend a lot of time working with your frontline staff on answering some of the questions you can anticipate from staff when they come. But yeah, we're very confident in our process and the process that we've talked about in our council as well, ongoing. So follow that process, you'll be fine.
I think that the statement that's been made lately is those guidelines were put in place with the assumption that everyone does have COVID in a gym, so that like it would be safe even if somebody is totally positive, and that's the mentality. And I think the proof is in the pudding. I mean, we'll see more. There's a survey out now to the entire industry in Canada to see, how many positive tests have had and then how many secondary. So you mentioned you've had 4 incidents you've dealt with. Has there been any secondary incident that have come from any of those 4?
Yeah, so we call them transmissions. We haven't had a single transmission in our organization. There hasn't been a transmission in British Columbia. So that's fantastic. That's what we're working towards. That's what our role and responsibilities to prevent transmissions within our facilities. And again, we have distance, hygiene, and protection in place to ensure that happens. And when one of those things is breached, one thing we remind our staff and our members about is, if distance breached and it happens, like you mentioned earlier, like, oh, we're super close or whatever, we also have hygiene in place and protection to pick up the slack of that one of the 3 guidelines that maybe falls off from time to time. So yeah, if somebody sneezes into the sleeve of their arm and that's sort of a breach of, let's call it hygiene, you're protected because you're distant, right? So we have all 3 of these measures in place so that we can anticipate one of them breaking down at one point while you're in one of our facilities. The other 2 are going to pick up the slack and ensure that you're safe and healthy.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, the proof is in the pudding. I've heard across the board from millions of check-ins, there hasn't been a transmission in a gym as of yet. The only incidents where there was one was in a facility that was not following the guidelines, and it was it was very public, and it was very, it didn't serve anybody very well. But once it was dug in, it was very clear that they were nowhere clear to what the guidelines, to what the guidelines were exactly. And that was it. And so I think that's been, again, real positive, and something that the public there hasn't been too many stories about that, right? About how many, how little transmission there's been, or how the first positive story I've seen yet was the last week. There was the Ottawa health person said there has not been a transmission in a gym or a restaurant or on public transit. And that was the first time someone said something very positive that went into the press about that. And on a couple of podcasts ago, we talked with Dr. Greg Wells, who's a respiratory illness researcher, and he went through the science of how COVID spreads. And when he went through the science of it, he also had looked at the guidelines and thought he was very impressed with the guidelines that the fitness industry had put into place. He highlighted where the risks were, where the elevated risks were with what we know about airborne transmission. But the fact that facilities, for the most part, are so big and people are this spaced out and the air is recirculated, and people have a limited time in that facility, so they're limiting any potential exposure as well. It just led to the fact that there was risk is really, really being mitigated, for the most part, especially in gyms and in bigger facilities. That way, there's slightly different risks around aerobic activity and around smaller spaces that are doing a lot of aerobic activity that the doctors have had concerns about. And obviously there's been other rules put in place about that. But I think for the most part, like I said, the proof is in the pudding, and we'll know more when we get these stats out from this survey that's gone out to the industry, where we can say, hey, this is what's happening in Canada, and we can actually put some numbers behind it. Did you notice any difference? I mean, obviously when you had a positive test, I don't know if it went into the press and it said like somebody tested positive in Club 16 or anything like that. Any notice from, but when, I guess the other question is as you're seeing incidents also go up, and maybe there's something that gets out about that this person was in a gym or something, any reaction from the staff or members to that?
So there's the one thing I'll say on the press is, again, there's notification to the press the majority of time when there's not guidelines in place or people aren't following the guidelines. Like that's what I'm talking about in terms of building a strong relationship with your health authorities and proving to them through communication with members, education with members and staff. That's where the health authorities feel the need to tell the press, okay, if you were at this nightclub from this time to this time, okay, like we have no contact tracing, we have no real guidelines in place here. We need to tell the public because the public is at risk. Whereas in fitness facilities, again, we have that contact tracing, and right away, we're a legit time saver for the health authorities in that process of trying to contact businesses that this individual who has COVID has been into and possibly exposed. Can you ask the second part of your question in terms of staff and members?
Just like once they'd heard about it, did you see any change in behavior? Did members, slow down what they came? Did staff, have apprehension with coming into work? Anything like that? Like any repercussion from anything like that?
Yeah. So the first exposure case that we dealt with, that happened. Staff needed to be further educated and further supported, which we did. We sent out myself and then a member of our regional group to the club the day of and then the day after. And just coached them and walked them through some of the concerns, and again shared that distance, hygiene, protections in place that not only protects the members but yourselves. And so that did need to take place. But I'll tell you that it's happening in all businesses, all industries, and it's legitimately becoming part of the norm. Like it is the norm to be notified that somebody within any business, a restaurant, a grocery store, has tested positive because of the amount of cases that we're getting now. When we first reopened, it was at about 10 per day of positive cases in BC, and now we're at about 100, 120 per day. So it's inevitable. And so all those 100, 120 people per day, they take a look at the businesses that all 100 of those people per day have been in for the last 14 days. So you can imagine that's upwards of probably 1,000 businesses that the government in BC has to contact on a daily basis and do contact tracing for and see if there is even contact tracing. So again, I'm confident in the fact that as an industry, we're at the top of the list in terms of relief when they find out where somebody's been. Oh, it's a gym. Fantastic. Good. There's contact tracing.
Did you enjoy that clip? You can check out the whole podcast on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to get more content on the future of fitness.